Welcome back to another edition of Boilers Extra. I'm Nathan Baird from the Indy Star.
Sam King from the Journal and Courier.
We are in Notre Dame week. This is the preview episode for that big game that's coming up on Saturday. Purdue obviously opening the season with a blowout win of Indiana State, takes last week off, and then has this game that the nature of the game has changed a little bit. I don't know if the nature of the game, but the vibe around the game, the narrative around the game has changed a bit. Based on Notre Dame opening the season with a win over Texas A&M and then losing at home to Northern Illinois, as Notre Dame has sort of been wont to do here these last couple of years. So we're going to have Mike Berardino from the South Bend Tribune, our fellow Gannett Network paper, is going to come on and, I should say website, come on and talk to us about Notre Dame and kind of give us where that team is going into this game. But Sam, I thought we should start off with an update on where things stand for Purdue. There's obviously not a lot to break down. We don't have a game to kind of rehash because we already did that talking about the Indiana State game last week. But we should give people an update. When Ryan Walters had been talking all preseason camp about, well, when I first saw the schedule, I didn't like this early open week. And then when we started getting guys banged up in preseason camp, I thought maybe it was perfect. And then they'd get guys healthy for this game. And that's slightly worked in their favor, but not completely in their favor. Maybe give people an update just on where things stand as far as what we know, who will play, who can play, I should say anyway, and who definitely won't.
Yeah, so Purdue was with people who were expected to be key contributors against Indiana State, and you get half of those guys back at least, which is a good sign. But the two that aren't playing are the two who we had the most concerns about. Quarterback Nyland Green, as we've noted several times, was kind of standing out in fall camp before he got hurt, and receiver CJ Smith, who when we did our preseason bold predictions, I said Purdue would win Notre Dame and be an X factor. So that's out the window, obviously.
Yep.
But you do get Corey Stewart back at left tackle, who's started a lot of games at Ball State. Clearly was somebody who had emerged as one of the best linemen who had throughout fall camp. And you get Kim Brown back, who, the UCLA transfer, I'm not sure what he has because we haven't seen a whole lot of him, but he is certainly depth at the receiver position and somebody who's got a lot of experience and somebody who offensive coordinator Graham Harrell noted this week is kind of a leader and sees things maybe a little differently, maybe more from a coaching perspective because he's been out. So that is something to add to the room against Notre Dame.
Yeah, the way he talked about Brown, I thought was interesting because maybe just from a pure talent standpoint, I never thought that would be the same kind of addition as maybe bringing someone like Smith back. I thought Smith was going to maybe be an important addition this week just to help equate the talent that this is such a good secondary that Notre Dame has. Any time you could put maybe a more dynamic receiver on the field, maybe that could make a difference. But I guess it's up to Purdue to try to keep this game, be in a situation in this game in the fourth quarter where it's a winnable game, and someone like Cam Brown and his experience and his perspective, even if it's just seeing something that he says to somebody, maybe it could make a difference. I did think, Green and Smith were the ones that were sort of hanging out there. We knew Stewart was always projected to be back for this game. And at one time, it sounded like they were optimistic that Green and Smith would both be back. And then they started, definitely by last week, Ryan Walters had really backed off of that. And I thought it was pretty pessimistic that either one of them would be back. But Stewart could be a big part of Saturday's game because this is a strong defense, regardless of what happened against Northern Illinois last week. It's a team that can stop teams from moving the ball pretty effectively. And someone like Stewart coming back in, even if it's someone who hasn't previously played really at the Notre Dame level before, but he's so experienced. I'm sure he's been waiting for this moment. And the offensive line, at least I think the first string offensive line was fine in the opener, but anytime you can put him in there, move people maybe back to where they're supposed to be across all five starting spots, I think that raises the potential for this team to be able to move the ball enough against Notre Dame. Will it be enough? I don't know, but it definitely gives them, again, if it's a game that they can keep as close as some might predict deep into this game, then him being in there for 1 3rd and 2 play could be a significant difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he's somebody, Corey Stewart is somebody I try to watch during camp, but first of all, I'm not an offensive line guru. Secondly, it's just hard to gauge the talent of the linemen when they're going against Purdue every single day. But from what we've been told, the coaches think this is a huge upgrade. I think Ryan Walters said he's definitely one of our 5 best linemen, which tells you he's a starting caliber tackle, and he was listed at the top of the depth chart heading into the Indiana State game. So that tells me that his injury probably wasn't very significant, and that was maybe hopeful that he could play that game. No reason to rush him back if he did have any sort of hiccup. So clearly you would want him more healthy 2 weeks down the road, which seems to be the case. And you're right. Even though Northern Illinois beat Notre Dame last weekend, it did not march up and down the field. The points came off of turnovers, or there was one big play early that led to a touchdown. So it's not like even with Texas A&M, teams are not moving the ball methodically down the field against Notre Dame. You're going to have to hope you hit some big plays, or hope you get a punt block or an interception or something to really give your offense a jolt, because I think this Notre Dame secondary is clearly an upgrade from Indiana State, but probably one of the best in the country as well.
One last thing before we bring Mike in, just to give people an update on Green and Smith, because again, there was some optimism at some point that they could be back by this point. Obviously, the next 2 weeks, regardless of what happens this week, I think we both projected these next 2 games, going at Oregon State, playing Nebraska at home in the season opener, could be a really important kind of inflection point for where this season could go. Do we think they could play in those 2 games?
Yeah, I think that's, from what I've been told, it sounds like Smith is closer than Green at this point. But the realistic thing is you want to do well in the Big Ten Conference. And, from Purdue's perspective, you're probably not going to compete for a conference championship. So ideally, you're really playing maybe for 6 wins to get to a bowl game, get that 13th game. But the sooner you guys can come back, the better. I think, sounds like, and Ryan Walters even said, I can't watch these guys rehab because it makes me too anxious for them to get back on the field, because clearly they look good enough to contribute. I think it's going to be, maybe one next week, maybe one the week after, but certainly here in the next couple of weeks, I would expect to see those guys back, it sounds like.
So we are going to bring on our fellow Gannett Network beat writer here, Mike Berardino from South Bend Tribune. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you guys. You hear me okay?
Yeah, everything's good. And obviously an interesting start to the season.
All right, good deal. I never know with the tech side of things.
Yeah. Well, obviously an interesting start to the season.
A 1-1 record would not have been surprising going into this game. It's just how they got there. And how they got there means everything for Notre Dame, because there's existential questions now. From the top of the heap all the way down. This is a university with a new athletic director, Pete Bavacqua, a new university president after decades of John Jenkins. Now it's Bob Dowd. And it's probably not a good time to underperform drastically if you're Marcus Freeman. But by the same token, 1 loss after 2 games, if they had lost at A&M in a tight one and then blown out Northern Illinois as expected, and then run the table from there. Hard to imagine at this point, but it's still possible. Well, that would have been perfectly understandable and would get you a spot in the playoffs. So this game's fascinating suddenly at Purdue this week. And after listening to Sam on our Pot of Gold yesterday, I think there's more to be concerned about than ever for Notre Dame.
Let's jump straight to Marcus Freeman, because there's obviously a Purdue connection here. He was a co-defensive coordinator earlier in his career, and I was covering the team at that time and was seen as like one of the bright young assistants in the game, like up and coming guy. And then he goes on to Cincinnati and obviously just kind of takes off from there. So that destiny was sort of fulfilled. I don't know if people saw him getting to maybe be the head coach at Notre Dame that fast, but here we are. Yet, at some point when things happen repeatedly, a trend kind of turns into an identity, and this Northern Illinois Texas A&M situation is not the latest example, just the latest example of a program that seems to be kind of rising to the toughest challenges and maybe dipping down to the lesser challenges on the schedule. So just how important is this next few weeks even for Marcus Freeman, because you're in year 3, and if it seems like this is going to keep happening, that doesn't seem like something that as you're kind of intimating, that the Notre Dame leadership is going to be okay with long term.
Yeah, I don't want to sound the alarm bell just yet, but I chose this background of the brick wall because my back's against the wall. I think the program's back is against the wall. But that's the week to week cycle of football. Marcus Freeman's done so many things right, and especially on the recruiting trail and just as a representative of the university. And every time, even in the aftermath of losses to Marshall and Stanford, and this one, poised, stoic. He gave a reading material out to the team last summer, the whole Marcus Aurelius stoicism cult, and he turned them on to that, and that's a good way to generally to navigate through highs and lows. He brought them up so high at A&M, and you saw the pregame stuff in the tunnel, which you just don't see outside of, say, that World Wrestling. But it was that level of intensity, and of course it was 90 degrees, all kinds of excuses. It would not have been shocking for them to have a flat performance against NIU in the follow-up. That doesn't suggest overall program rot or anything, but they had to find a way, and they had to snap to attention, and that didn't really happen. Now should be finding out more about Riley Leonard in the days to come, if not the next couple hours, as Marcus will talk again on a Zoom call with reporters. But it might be right up until game time. You might even need to see how he performs in the first half before they decide to make a change to a guy who won the Sun Bowl for them or was helpful in the Sun Bowl, Steve Angeli. Marcus Freeman, the word you hear about is growth all the time. They wanted to give him an opportunity to grow. Tough place to grow into the job with all these eyeballs and all this, the NBC contract, the Under Armour contract. There's a lot at stake. And oh, by the way, 36 years since the last national title, and they're getting a little antsy. But
Sure.
No reason to think that that if this goes well this week and then you start to accumulate momentum again. We've seen it that after Marshall, after that Marshall loss in 22, he was 0-3 as a coach because he had coached the Fiesta Bowl, and that second half got away from him against Oklahoma State. So 0-3 after Marshall feels a whole lot different than a guy with 20 career wins in the bank after NIU. I think they'll figure out a way forward, whether that means they win this week or not. That's why we play the games.
Mike, obviously.
I just want to say real quick, Riley Leonard, the quarterback, suffered a non-throwing shoulder injury against Northern Illinois, and that's been the question that Mike was kind of referring to there as to his status for this week. Go ahead, Sam.
Is there a silver lining maybe in what happened against Northern Illinois? Because, these Purdue players and coaches all week have said, we expect an angry, a focused team to come in here. And not to say that Notre Dame didn't respect NIU or doesn't respect Purdue, but I think that something like that, it's still very possible Notre Dame is a playoff team if it runs the table. But you can't have another setback. Is there maybe some silver lining that this happened early and maybe, woke up these guys a little bit that, this is what happens when you don't come to play?
I mean, it's not uncommon for even teams that make it to the championship level to have an early season stub of the toe. That's not, I don't think they were looking for a silver lining. They should not have needed any sort of wake up call, Sam, but certainly whatever their most attentive, because the weird thing about it is, sometimes after you get back 4 a.m. after the game at a night game at College Station, and you might, things might seep out. You might hear about, well, they took it easy on practice or let them out early or whatever. That, according to Marcus Freeman, at least the Tuesday, Wednesday practices last week were as intense as they could structure them. So they were not going to, he said they doubled down. So if that's what happens after doubling down, which seemed like the smart coaching move, you do have to wonder. But no, angry, I would expect that would make sense. And you're starting to hear some of this us against the world playbook come out. There's some references to, the world turning on them or the media, this and that. whatever they have to use. That's what young athletes are going to have to use. And bottom line is talent for talent. They're playing a Big Ten team that's on the rise or in the early stages of a return to prominence. And talk about a statement win at A&M. I don't know that Notre Dame can make a statement other than like we're still here. But this is a statement game for Purdue and one that should be interesting.
Yeah, it seems like it could be a silver lining as far as their preparation for this game or their attentiveness for this game. It's hard to spin it as a silver lining for a whole season, especially for a team that's playoff aspirant and unlike if they were a Big Ten team, doesn't have an abundance of significant games over the course of the season to try to counter losing a game like Northern Illinois. No offense to the Huskies. I want to talk a little bit about how these teams match up because Notre Dame so far this year, and last year I looked, their explosive plays, they weren't an elite team, but they were kind of good enough for the most part, especially with a defense that was pretty solid. Right now, they're one of 20 teams, very small sample size, one of 20 teams with 5 or fewer 20-plus yard plays. It's only through 2 games, but that's still not that many through 2 games, especially when one of them comes against a team from the MAC. So Purdue's a defense that takes chances, but and that can open up big plays. It's kind of a risk-reward approach that this Ryan Walters defense takes. How key do you think it is for Notre Dame to start showing some explosiveness this week? And do you think that Riley Leonard's status is a big part of that?
I would almost go, no, you raise a good point, but I would say that I'd like to see the basics reinforced. I'd like to see them just run the ball and prove that they can get this revamped offensive line into a rhythm. They have in Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price, they have weapons there who can get yards after contact, who can take it to the house, who've gotten carries even last year that were flashes, and even this year show like they can divvy up the load that Audric Estime had almost to himself last year. Yes, but to this point, the designed runs for Riley Leonard have taken away from, say, the rhythm that a Love or a Price could get into. I think you're going to see if Leonard indeed plays very little designed run. He did not have any designed runs in the second half after being thrown down forcefully. It looked like at one point it looked like it might be the leg or the ankle area, but it was the left arm that he was tucking close to his body after he came up. Trainers came out and looked at him. So if they didn't use designed runs in the second half, I think what I'd like to see, I know you're talking about explosive plays. No reason he can't be explosive where you just keep, the water torture of off tackle, counter, just do what Notre Dame traditionally has done and wear down a defense. I think they have the capability of doing that. Haven't been patient enough to do it. I'm not sure Riley Leonard at this stage, even fully healthy, even when he was at Duke, was not the most accurate passer. And the downfield ball, it looks pretty, but it's not necessarily where it needs to be. In his defense, Jaden Greathouse had a drop. Jaden Greathouse very sure-handed at wideout, just a sophomore, but he had a key drop late in the first half that might have changed the complexion of the game on about a 25-yard ball, right? Perfectly thrown ball down the left sideline. I don't think you're going to see him come out here and try to go deep. I think they just need Mitch. You'll see more of Mitchell Evans, the tight end. They've been working him back. He's 10 months removed from ACL surgery. Hugely important part of the offense last year, especially on third down. Tight end at Notre Dame, always a big deal. This is their best tight end, and he got 20 snaps last week. And if he could double that this week, double his targets, I think that would make things move more smoothly.
Could you give just a quick rundown here? People, I think, just generally know that this is a strong defense. They probably even know some of these names, but what makes this defense so good? And do you give you any concept yet of how they might attack Purdue, which has this, it's an air raid offense. It's what Graham Harrell was based in off the Mike Leach tree. But at the same time, they incorporate tight ends more than that. They led the Big Ten in rushing yards per game last year. It's maybe not a conventional air raid look.
Yeah, well, even Sam and I talked yesterday about the on our podcast about the USC matchups with Notre Dame when Graham Harrell was at USC calling the plays in 19 and 21. Very balanced run pass in those games and very productive. Averaged 427 yards of total offense. USC with Keaton Slovis. So that was that was pre Al Golden. That was a Marcus Freeman led defense in 21, and that was a Clark Lee defense in 19. Al Golden's defense, he came from the Bengals most recently. Super Bowl trip with the Bengals, and it's NFL style. What does that mean? Well, I mean, it's as complex as probably any defense can get on the college level. Because of that, he does not spoon feed them, and this is year 3 of it. And you have Jack Kaiser, former Indy star, Mr. Football, wearing the green dot headset and running this thing at linebacker and making sure everybody's lined up where they need to be. Not a lot of blown coverages, although there was 83-yard. There was not a blown coverage on the 83-yard touchdown the other day to Ontario Brown out of the backfield. That was kind of fluky, but Ben Morrison more so went for the interception rather than just the safe takedown of the would have been about a 10-yard game. This is a group that was the longest touchdown pass. 83 is pretty long, that had been given up by an Al Golden defense here. 80-yarder at North Carolina back in 22 was another fluky kind of play, but no, very sound. Howard Cross, Riley Mills up the middle should be run stuffers and can also get to the quarterback. You've got athleticism off the edges. Jalen Sneed is a guy who can get to the quarterback. You're seeing more of Jaden Osbury. He's a redshirt freshman. At linebacker, you're seeing Drake Bowen, another Indy star, Mr. Football, is getting more and more snaps up the middle. Starts at what was J.D. Bertrand's lockdown spot for the last few years. So, and this Ben Morrison we mentioned, Christian Gray is flashed early on, very reliable as a first-year starter at the other corner, and of course you have Bronco Nagurski Award winner Xavier Watts in the back. Xavier Watts has only missed 1 snap in 2 games at safety for a secondary that rotates quite a bit. So he's essential to what they're trying to do. And they've got a couple of transfers in there in that secondary from Arizona State. Ryan Clark's son, Jordan Clark, who is in the slot, and Rod Hurd, the second from Northwestern, who seems to be gaining more confidence in this scheme. It's very complicated, but they seem to grasp it.
You mentioned, maybe Notre Dame being able to just sort of grind out some yards to keep the chains moving. And I think there is some responsibility on Purdue's front 7 to kind of step up and show that it can handle this challenge. At the same time, they pride themselves on the pass rush and attacking, and it's going to be, coming from every direction. Where does this offensive line stand? Because coming into the year, there was definitely some question as to how this was going to look early on, correct? How has it looked through 2 games?
There's still question because they're so young.
Yeah.
Even after 2 games, that's 16 career starts now for that group. Left tackle Anthony Knapp, about 290 pounds, true freshman. 290 at left tackle. He's quick, but there aren't too many sub 300-pound left tackles in at the top level of the sport in college ball. Sam Pendleton is a redshirt freshman at left guard, and that was a surprise because his emergence has left 2 guys with a combined 23 career starts who are healthy reserves in Pat Coogan, Rocco Spindler. They're in the background. They're not playing. So that's how good Sam Pendleton was in August and how much upside they see for him. They're willing to live with some of the blips now to get the best 5 on the field. Ashton Craig, Lawrenceburg, Indiana guy at center, is now a grizzled veteran of 5 career starts. And Billy Schrouth, a Wisconsin cheeser at right guard, hugely sought after recruit and a road grader, and getting you can run behind him. And then Emil Wagner from Marcus Freeman's high school in Huber Heights is the right tackle. And this is a guy also in his first year as a starter, third year on campus, and maybe also a little bit light for a right tackle. So it's not, when you talk about sending Joe Alt and Blake Fisher to the NFL, both in the first 2 rounds of this past NFL draft, those are your bookends. You're going to have some growing pains. They really thought getting out of A&M with the win, that now they could grow on the job with these guys and with perhaps work in some of the reserves, whatever, just get behind them. These 5, they want them to play, but instead they're under duress, and as you say, they're going to bring it. And Riley Leonard's taken a lot of hits already. Too many hits. One is too many, even without a lingering issue, and they're going to have to grow up on the job in real time.
Mike, that is a fantastic rundown on what Purdue is going to face on Saturday from Notre Dame. Thanks for joining us today. And everyone should read his work in the South Bend Tribune. A lot of great preview stuff for this matchup. And safe travels down here on Saturday.
See you on Saturday, Mike.
That was Mike Berardino from the South Bend Tribune. We thank him for joining us today. And Sam, one thing I didn't ask him, because I think I actually know the answer, I want to kind of pivot this a little bit, is just the aura around this game, or the lack of it. Because I was doing another podcast, a Notre Dame podcast on Wednesday, and during that game, and I think we were talking about for Notre Dame, for Purdue, there's only one Notre Dame, really. Like, there's other big games. You play, big teams in the Big Ten, but there's kind of only one Notre Dame that, like, in state, but also sort of on an island, historic power. You had this long history with them that goes back decades, that's only been interrupted recently. But at the same time, I think that for Notre Dame, there are kind of a lot of Purdue's. Like, they have similar teams like this that have cycled through their schedule every so often, whether it's Michigan State that they've had some interesting matchups with over the years, or whoever. I don't think it matters to them as much that maybe that Purdue is in state. I guess just you're there. I'm down here in Indy kind of going back and forth, but you're living in the middle of it. What kind of vibe are you feeling around this game this week? Are people excited? Do you get a sense that they're looking at the resumption of this series, even if it's only going to be for the next 5 years? And I guess it's kind of resuming in earnest because they played in 21. But do you feel like there's a vibe around this being a special game?
I think you're absolutely right that the Shillelagh Trophy, which is on the line in this game, it is a traveling trophy game. But I think that if the way Purdue views it and the way Notre Dame views it is probably completely opposite. I think Purdue realizes if you beat Notre Dame, and because this is a non-conference opponent, it's always early in the season, you really, and you wrote about this week, what it meant for Jack Mollenkopf, what it meant for Joe Tiller early in their careers. You really jumpstart your season, and it doesn't happen very often. Purdue's got its fair share of wins against Notre Dame, but not enough to where you would be like, this is really even every year type of must-watch matchup. For Notre Dame, you're right. Obviously, the aspirations are quite different there. The expectations, people talking about Marcus Freeman being on the hot seat 2 games into a season in his third year, something that probably wouldn't happen at Purdue unless catastrophic circumstances arose. But for Ryan Walters, for that staff, this is a chance to, maybe losing doesn't hurt you, especially if it's a close game. But I think winning significantly helps the way that your program is viewed, because it's Notre Dame. There's going to be a more national spotlight on what Purdue does this week. And if you get a win, that's the kind of thing that leads off a Sports Center, that is the talk of all the national college football shows. And because of that, I think that it's always going to be something that Purdue views as like an opportunity to really make your program jump to that next level, or get that national prominence, or, even if it's only temporary. It is a big deal if you can beat Notre Dame. Now, if you go out and lose by 28 points, it's going to be an afterthought. And I think that you'll have probably your reasonable fans, if that happens, that say, Purdue's talent level is probably not on par with what Notre Dame has, although I think that gap has shrunk significantly since that 2021 meeting. But you also have the fans, as there always are, that are like, we can never beat Notre Dame. This is an in-state team. we should be able to compete with that. We should be competing for the same recruits, which is not the case, especially now with NIL and everything. It's just, it's not a level playing field by any means. But this is clearly a game that Purdue fans right now are optimistic about because Purdue wins its season opener 49-0. Granted, it was Indiana State, but things look like they're going well right now. A lot of people, for various reasons, really believe in Ryan Walters and this staff, that it can just get back to where Purdue was a few years ago, where Purdue was in, people forget, Purdue was in the Big Ten championship game 2 seasons ago. Now, granted, a lot of those guys who were star players for that team are now in the NFL, but Purdue is a team that historically can have these years where you win 7, 8, 9 games and be consistent with it. And that's what fans probably realistically would just, they would love if Purdue was in that situation every year where you're being an 8-win team. But to do that, at least in the short term, you're going to have to be able to beat Notre Dame a couple times.
Yeah, and it's why I think this is such an important game for Purdue, regardless of what happened to Notre Dame last week. That definitely, plummeted them down the rankings from being a top 10 team to being, in the 18th or whatever, which I'm actually a little bit surprised. If they hadn't opened with a win at Texas A&M, they wouldn't even be probably ranked being 1-1 at this point. If they had just played, I don't know, Navy or whoever they play in an early game. But it still seems like a huge game for Purdue just because there is an aura to Notre Dame. And Purdue is a team that's trying to prove itself on the national stage again. Last year wasn't a collapse, but it was definitely a step back from where they had been just a couple years ago, being in the Big Ten championship game and in prominence. And I was thinking about it this way. If the last win for Purdue in this series was 2007, now obviously it got interrupted after 2014. They've only played once since then. So it's not that like they've lost every year since 2007. But unless you were like a really precocious little Boilermaker fan, that means you probably had to be born before 2000, realistically, to remember Purdue beating Notre Dame. So you've got a whole generation of Purdue fans who don't know what it means to beat Notre Dame. Every other generation does. Like even when there were long stretches of guys, coaches, and teams that couldn't beat Notre Dame, somebody broke through at one point. And when I did that story earlier this week that you were talking about, and Tiller and Mollenkopf are the only 2 coaches in the last 70 plus years who beat Notre Dame on their first try, and then they went on to the careers that they had. And I don't think that's necessarily coincidental. But also even through those years, you saw them both be in a situation where once in a while you rose up and upset Notre Dame, and once in a while you had the edge. Once in a while, especially during Tiller's era, Purdue was had kind of flipped places with Notre Dame as far as prominence, maybe even for a short window, but then you capitalized on that. When a team was down, you took advantage of that. And I think that means that in this 5-year stretch that they have coming up, just from an esteem standpoint, just from a sort of proof of concept for the program, you got to find a way to beat Notre Dame. I don't think they can come out of this 5-year stretch, no matter how good Notre Dame is, and just kind of throw their hands up and say, well, it's Notre Dame. What are you going to do? This next 5 years, at some point, they need to step up and show that they can win that game. Because as you said, they've done it. But there have been stretches in Purdue history, by the way, where there was one that I cite, like this series started again, like as an annual thing in 1946. The first 4 years of that series, it was Notre Dame went 4 years without losing a game, I think, or there may have been one loss. There were 3 national championships in 1 year that they finished second. Okay, so nobody was beating Notre Dame in those years. You kind of get a pass for not beating them in those years. But I think in this next 5-year stretch, Ryan Walters, if he's still here for those full 5 years, you've got to find a way to break through and beat Notre Dame.
Yeah, and kind of going back to what a big deal it is. Last summer, I talked with Taylor Stubblefield, the great All-American receiver from Purdue, and he said people still to this day come up and ask him, weekly, if not daily, about the touchdown he had against Notre Dame, which is over 2 decades ago. Right. And it's still fresh in people's memory because there are so few high points against playing a team of that prestige that it's a memory that sticks with Purdue fans for forever.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about this specific matchup before we get to making our predictions on this game. I was talking to someone yesterday. I was talking to Gary Danielson yesterday, former Purdue quarterback, and is going to be the color analyst for the CBS broadcast of this game, which is his first Purdue game in a number of years. We were just talking about this matchup, and he said, the key of the game to me is which offensive line will be able to handle the other team's front seven. And that was something that we just talked to Mike about as well, especially as it relates to Notre Dame's young offensive line. And it's now protecting a quarterback in his first year in the program, a veteran quarterback, but a first year in the system, against this Purdue front seven, which is obviously reworked and had some additions, and they're only had one game to test that out. Coming out of that Indiana State game, how much extra confidence do you take from that performance that this is a game that Purdue could actually go in and maybe take advantage of a younger offensive line? Or should we almost kind of dismiss that and say that's what you're supposed to do against Indiana State? It's really no test of what you might have to do against Notre Dame.
Yeah, I had asked a couple of players this week kind of generally about that game, because when you win 49-0, it's hard to find any flaws. A lot of these players said when you go watch the film, there were things, whether it's technique or just misassignment, whatever it is, that weren't perfect. And that's kind of a key when you win a game like that, is picking the points where you can always find ways to get better, even in a blowout victory. And it sounds like Purdue realizes and understands that it was supposed to win that game 49-0, 56-0, whatever it was, just go out and annihilate a bad team. But kind of because this is Notre Dame, the stakes are raised a little bit, and it can really give your program a jolt. I think that Purdue's able to, apply some of the, the things that weren't so great from that Indiana State game to get better, so that performance, you're not going to go out and win 49-0 for sure on Saturday, but your best version with the extra preparation that you had last week, having an open Saturday. You would think that in some way is going to pay off. Whether that leads to a win or not remains to be seen. But I think that, the schedule, the way it's set up, kind of is, even without Green and Smith in the lineup, kind of ideal for Notre Dame being your next opponent.
And I think the opposite works also for Purdue in this game. Danielson talking about how important the offensive line is going to be. This is a strong veteran defensive front for Notre Dame. The Indiana State had no match physically for what Purdue had on the field that day. And especially getting Corey Stewart back, this offensive line needs to be able to, I don't think you go in and say you're going to assert yourself on a down-to-down basis. You're going to have to play to some stalemates. You're going to have to bounce back when they beat you, but you've got to be able to win short yardage situations, whether that's in the red zone and near the goal line, or whether that's just at your own 38 and it's 3rd and 2. You can't give that possession away. You've got to find a way to keep those chains moving. I think that is a really significant part of this game, because if Hudson Card goes 24 of 25 again on Saturday, I will eat this desk. That's not going to happen, right? They're gonna get disrupted more. There's probably going to be football adversity that happens in a game like this, and I do think that this is a pretty significant challenge. I think coming into the season, I thought of it as Hudson Card having to rise to the occasion. I still think that you're going to have to, in games like this against teams like this, you maybe don't have to always have the better quarterback, but you can't have a bad one. And he has to play well for them to be able to win games like this. But I think that this offensive line, and making sure that on early downs, you're not putting this offense in a place where you're throwing on Notre Dame's terms, because they have a really strong secondary and will take advantage of that. And that on those short yardage situations, you're converting in the most crucial spots. This is a big game for this offensive line.
Yeah, absolutely. And whether you win or lose, it's an important game, just because you're going to see some of the best players in the country. And that ideally makes you better when you do go to Oregon State, when you do play Nebraska and go to Wisconsin in the coming weeks. So, I think that the good thing, and I've talked about this, is Marcus Bowe, Gus Hartwig, Mahaman Musa, those guys have played together quite a bit. But the Corey Stewart, DJ Wingfield, those guys are new. So there's still some implementing of getting used to playing with each other. And Purdue also does kind of rotate linemen a little bit. Whether they do this game Definitely not as much as the last game, but that remains to be seen because you're going to want your best unit out there as much as you can have them out there. But I definitely think this is a great early test just for that line to see a defensive front of that caliber. Now the secondary is a whole different issue, and I know Mike mentioned Xavier Watts, and that's a guy that every time I watch Notre Dame play, I don't know why the ball even goes in his direction, because he seems to be kind of like a, not to say they're comparable players, but Dylan Thieneman is a guy that just erases a window that quarterbacks possibly see, and Xavier Watts is the same way. Is you think this is a big completion and it ends up being a turnover or something bad for your offense. But the more time you can give Hudson Card to scan these weapons that we've talked about here for the last few weeks that are added or can open holes for Devin Mockabee or Reggie Love, the better it's going to be, because I do think that Purdue is going to have to hit at some point a big play down the field that kind of gets this crowd pumped, gets the crowd into it, and gives you a little momentum that you can, if you're Purdue, hopefully ride to, a good outcome.
And one thing I wanted to reach back to again, I asked Mike about it, and he kind of took it another direction as far as how Notre Dame just kind of needs to be maybe systematically moving the ball down the field. I get where he's coming from, because that was an issue for them last week. At the same time, allowing big plays was a big issue for this defense last year, for Purdue defense. And obviously, again, Indiana State could not really challenge them in that way. And when I look at why that's important for this team to improve on last year's record, I don't look at it as Purdue can't allow big plays to Ohio State and Oregon, because I'm telling you right now, it's going to happen. Like, you already thought Ohio State's offense was really good. They had this kid, Jeremiah Smith, show up, and he might be the best receiver in the country. I'm not kidding. He's incredible. We saw it all spring when I was covering that team. And you're just not going to be able to match that. Even with Nyland Greenback, you're not going to be able to match the talent level that some teams like that have. But I think it's crucial in games like this, where you're playing an opponent that at its nature is not necessarily explosive. Now, part of Purdue's defense, like I said, and Gary Danielson brought this up, when you're attacking that much from different angles, you're leaving your corners one-on-one a lot. It's creating opportunities for the other team. Sometimes there's a risk reward that goes into that. I'll give you an example, and it happened in a Notre Dame game 2 years ago. Notre Dame was playing at Ohio State. The very first play of the game, Ohio State brought a cornerback blitz, and the quarterback for Notre Dame at the time, whose name I'm forgetting, I think it was the one who transferred to Alabama, I'm blanking on his name, but saw it, hit the guy on the sideline, and he took it down into the red zone. And Ohio State held him to a field goal, but still, first play of the game, they're giving up an explosive play because the other team recognized the blitz, saw it coming, probably from something they'd seen on film, took its shot, and was downfield in the blink of an eye. There's only so many times that can happen to Purdue in a game like this, when scoring its own points might be tough against a good defense, that it can then overcome. You don't want to ask your defense to have to constantly be keeping red zone possessions to field goals. I think it's going to happen at some point on Saturday, but if it becomes repetitive, if Riley Leonard kind of rises to the occasion and takes advantage of those opportunities, that could, I think, be a bad thing for Purdue.
Yeah, and Mike did allude to this, and I saw it when it happened. Jaden Greathouse had a big play that downfield, and the ball just bounced off his hands, and you're kind of like, that might have been a touchdown. It certainly would have been a 30+ yard gain if he catches that ball. So it's not like Notre Dame can't hit the big play, but you have to be perfect in some of those situations. And Graham Harrell even talked about this week, each yard the ball travels down the field, the less likely it is to be complete. And in that instance, he was talking about Hudson Card's incompletion against Indiana State. That was a bomb to Jamal Edrin. But the window does close, especially when there's a Dylan Thieneman for Purdue or a Xavier Watts on the other side for Notre Dame. But I think that is going to be something that this game is won by a team hitting a big play that really gets the momentum going for that offense.
And I think that Greathouse play is actually evidence of both things. You're right that Notre Dame showed it can do it, and it just didn't capitalize. But it also showed, Northern Illinois showed what can happen when you limit the number of times you even give an opponent that opening, because then they didn't capitalize on that one, and then that was kind of it. Like, they didn't really have other big shots. And I agree with Mike. I don't know that Riley Leonard is your downfield bomb guy anyway. I think it's more a point of when Purdue brings Antonio Stevens on a strong safety blitz, does Riley Leonard see that and hit a guy, and now that guy's off to the races, right? It's going to have to be these like momentary, very instantaneous things that you try to see as an experienced veteran quarterback, and he's seen a lot of defenses over the years. So it's just something I have in the back of my mind that I think it'll probably happen at some point in that game. Notre Dame can certainly take advantage of it more than Indiana State could, but that is the risk reward. Does Purdue have enough other plays where, it sacks Riley Leonard, it creates a turnover, it does something else, a big TFL that kind of negates those things? So anything else that you wanted to talk about, just angles about what's going to decide this game on Saturday?
I think that's a guy we haven't talked about, who we always do, is Kadron Jenkins. And he's, he's not been quiet about it at all. Like this move is to prepare him for the NFL as a middle linebacker. And if he is that caliber of player, he's the guy who has to show out against Notre Dame, especially if, as Mike said, you would like to see Notre Dame methodically try to move the ball on the ground a little bit. That leaves a lot of opportunities for tackles if he's staying true to his natural position and getting in there and throwing guys around. And it's definitely a game where I feel like he can raise his stock if he has a good game against Notre Dame.
You saw this team a lot last year, so you're more familiar with how Ryan Walters does this and Kevin Kane. How often will they put a third true linebacker on the field? Is there a chance that we would see that at all, just against a team that is a little bit more run oriented, especially if Riley Leonard is limited and they have to go with a different quarterback?
Yeah, there were opportunities to do that last year, and Purdue did. And it's all going to be based on what you see. Now,
right.
When I watched Notre Dame, it looks like, most of the time, Notre Dame is going to have three receivers on the field, which would probably eliminate you putting a Jenkins and a Yanni Karlaftis out there at the same time. So I don't know how much we'll see it, especially if that's the route that Notre Dame goes. But, they're going to do what they think is best. And if that happens, I would think it's more because one of those linebackers is going to be blitzing.
So let's give our prediction. A few weeks ago on this podcast, we were talking about going into the season, and I said, I think maybe you had predicted that they would beat Notre Dame, and I said, well, I'm not going to go as far as predict that they'll win, but I'm very curious what the betting line is going to be for this game. And I think if Notre Dame had thumped Northern Illinois as people expected, they were 28 and a half point favorite for that game and lost at home. That's tough to do. If that had happened, I think we would be seeing a pretty widespread. I think you might be talking about like a 16-point spread for a game like this, something like that. And instead, it opened at 12.5. It's down to 9.5 as of Thursday morning at some books. And I think I'm back. I was very intrigued when that was a game that I thought was going to be like a 16-point game. I would have said maybe, I think this is an interesting line to bet. And now I'm not so sure. Now I think it's probably almost swinging the other way. I will say this, regardless of what happened last week, this is good. Was Notre Dame a flawed team that was exposed against Northern Illinois? Is Notre Dame a really good team? It was good enough to go down and really handle Texas A&M in its own place that just had a really terrible week. I think maybe Saturday won't even necessarily answer that definitively. I just want to throw this out. There's a thing that comes out every year called the blue chip ratio, which is a measure of how many 4- and 5-star players you have on your roster. Just very simply is like that. And you can go back and look historically. If you don't have a preponderant, like more than half of your roster isn't 4- and 5 stars, you don't win national championships. So it's not really about how you'll do overall. It's more just about here are the teams that really have any chance historically, based on the data that we have, to contend for a national championship. Notre Dame was 9th on that list this year. 67% of its roster, 4 or 5 stars. I don't know what Purdue's is because they don't do the whole country. They don't do 130 teams. They just go with the ones that I think are 50% or better. And I don't think they release everybody's. But I do know as recently as the 2023 signing class, Purdue had 0 composite 4 stars. So there is a talent differential here, like a pure on paper talent differential. I think it's just a matter of which Notre Dame team shows up. I think the Notre Dame team that went down to Texas A&M would be a tough one for Purdue to beat. But I think the one that played against Northern Illinois, as much as I want to respect Northern Illinois, their defense is actually better than I had realized. I went back and looked last year. They were a top 25 defense overall. They were a top 10 defense in terms of opposing quarterback efficiency. I know that's against MAC competition, but it's still a respectable defense. But if you're Notre Dame, you can't just be playing MAC level offense. You have to be playing better than that, especially with ratios like this. So how much are you still thinking of Notre Dame as you're trying to predict a game like this? Not that predicting is the most important thing we do, but as you're thinking about how this game might unfold, are you still looking at Notre Dame as a really, really talented team that maybe just had the worst possible game? Or do you think that there are flaws here and Purdue is going to be able to exploit them?
Yeah, and kind of to redirect that, you mentioned all these 4- and 5-star guys. A couple of guys who, when I was watching them play in high school, Jack Kaiser, Drake Bowen, who are now starting for Notre Dame's defense. When I saw them in high school, when Jack Kaiser went to Notre Dame, I was like, he seemed more like a Purdue guy that would go there and develop and ultimately get in the lineup. And instead, he goes to Notre Dame and he's, starting 4 years on that defense. Drake Bowen, another kid that I was like, is Notre Dame a place where he's going to go succeed? Clearly proved me wrong, which, maybe that's telling about what my football projections are for high school players. But those are guys who were not big time recruits who have become big time players on top of all of those 5-star guys who you're mentioning. But listen, Notre Dame's really good. And the fact that Marcus Freeman made a concerted effort after losing a game last week to get in touch with Northern Illinois staff and say, hey, what did you do that had success against us so we can get better? And then to Northern Illinois' credit, because now Northern Illinois wants Notre Dame to run the table because it makes Northern Illinois' victory look that much better, gave the feedback and said, listen, we saw this on film. We knew we could expose this a little bit. That's going to benefit Notre Dame. But I just, I can't waver on kind of my, original prediction, even though I said CJ Smith would be a reason why I would maybe lean Purdue that game. This is a big deal for Purdue this week. The game sold out, within hours of tickets going on sale. Now, how many of those are people who resell tickets? We don't know. But it is also a lot of fans who are very excited and eager to be a statement game for this game. I think just kind of feel around it. Purdue's not making this a bigger deal than it is. Sometimes in the past, when Purdue, Notre Dame, I feel like, yes, Ryan Walters knows Notre Dame are aware of what Notre Dame is, but very much sounds like on the schedule type thing. I think it's going to be a close game, and it wouldn't shock me if Purdue is able to stay out and hedging my bet here. It's going to be a big play, maybe early. Want to be a team that's set the advantage.
So I am not changing my prediction from what I had preseason. So I'm still predicting Notre Dame 35, Purdue 20. I still think this will be a game into the fourth quarter, though. I think that I see that more as like this is a game and then Notre Dame gets a late score that puts it away. And I think if Nyland Green and CJ Smith had come back, which again, midway through camp, that was what they sort of expected, that maybe these guys could be on a trajectory. Ryan Walters, as recently as this week, is talking about how good they look in rehab, but that whatever medically, they're just not cleared to get back yet. If those guys were back, I think it helps you equate talent-wise. As I've said before, I think Nyland Green, if it's just a handful of times a game, the more he can negate the other team's best receiver and put pressure elsewhere on an offense, that goes a long way. I do think that Purdue's defense did show some things against Indiana State. I don't think necessarily, though, that was proof of concept of where this defense is yet. It's just a different league of opponent. So I'm going to just go with what I was seeing before the season. I'm going to still say Notre Dame 35, Purdue 20. That is somewhat misleading because I think it'll still be close in the fourth quarter. But I just don't know that Notre Dame is going to I think Notre Dame is going to have enough here from a talent standpoint to keep Purdue at arm's length. And then I think it's about how does Purdue respond from that? Does Purdue play well enough, even if it loses this game, that it gives them some momentum that they can take to Oregon State? Because I'm not just setting, I mean, obviously it'd be huge if Purdue won this game. I still really see that Oregon State, Nebraska back-to-back as being this potentially like critical turning point early in a season, because those are two teams that I think are more at an equal talent level with Purdue. I know Northern Illinois just proved where Notre Dame may be talent-wise. Maybe we're wrong about Notre Dame, but that might also just be the one shot that a team like that had to step up and get Notre Dame. The other factor here being that while Notre Dame was exposed, it's also kind of woken up and is probably on edge for a game like this in a way that it might not have been if it had beaten Northern Illinois by 30 points.
Yeah, and one of the things that defensive coordinator Al Golden mentioned this week when he's running through the players was one of the guys he talked about was Drew Bibber, who, no respect to Drew Bibber, he's a very good tight end, but he's the number 2 tight end. And most coaches aren't aware of, or at least openly in a press conference talking about that's a weapon. So I think that just kind of alludes to the fact that Notre Dame is scouring the depth chart and is aware of all of these players that Purdue has that can potentially hurt you.
We will be at Ross-Ade Stadium on Saturday, of course. We will be bringing a post-game pod. I know I said that last week. It's going to be, we believe, we have it set up. We'll get that to you on YouTube right after the game. So if you want to stay up late Saturday night, we will try to get that out to you. Regardless of that, he's Sam King. I'm Nathan Baird. Come back to IndyStar.com, JCOnline.com all weekend for more analysis and coverage of this big game for the Shillelagh on Saturday.